Hello, I'm Mark from Moonstone Publications. As another year draws to a close, it's a good time to reflect on the regulatory landscape and what may lie ahead in 2026. And so with me in the studio today is Billy Seyffert, Moonstone Compliance's Chief Operating Officer. Hello and welcome, Billy.
Morning, Mark. Nice to be back.
Let's first talk about OMNI-Risk Return. It's come out for public comments. What is your overall impression of the risk return?
Well, Mark, I think it's a couple of things. Firstly, some form of regulatory reporting is long overdue. You know, your general FSPs haven't reported to the FSCA since 2017, so that's a very long time. My impressions of the actual return, I think it's a massive improvement on the proposed OMNI conduct of business return, for the simple fact that I think they're going to get a lot more accurate information and it's going to be a lot less duplication. I think a lot of the information being asked is more readily at hand for financial institutions. I suppose the challenge is whether the information gathered is going to serve the purpose, which is initially to populate the supervisory technology that the FSCA is going to be using for supervision purposes going forward. The point of this is actually to try and profile you within a certain segment and in a certain risk profile.
The FSCA had 3 webinars recently. It was an opportunity for stakeholders to engage. During those webinars, I think there were some recurring questions from people that showed that there was some confusion about the risk return, what they had to do, who's filling it in, and how this fits in with other returns.
Yeah. So let's begin at the end. The person that's going to be responsible for submitting it will be somebody in the governing body of the FSP, owner, manager, member of the board, whatever. So it's not strictly speaking a compliance return as completed by a compliance officer, although I think many FSPs are going to rely very heavily on their compliance officer to help them submit it. I think confusion, I think it's an accurate comment. I think it arises from 2 aspects mainly. Firstly, I think some definitions need clarification. It's pitched at a level where if you're not a compliance person, sometimes you're going to be uncertain about what they're asking. So some clarity needs there. The other problem is that it's aimed at all financial institutions. And a number of questions are not going to be relevant on, let's call them intermediary FSPs, value of unclaimed benefits, arrear pension fund contributions, distribution channels, etc. So hopefully, we're busy making comments at the moment, so hopefully that stuff will be clarified. I think a solution would be that if your segmentation of what type of financial institution it is, it blocks out certain questions, might be handy. Otherwise, they're going to have to say only applicable to certain sectors. Another challenge that I've got is that for, the system, as I understand it, does not allow for not applicable. So when something is not applicable, you're going to enter a 0. And when you're working with numbers and using zeros instead of not applicables, that might corrupt the data. But let's see what happens. At the end of the day, there will be a pilot next year, and I think it is important that as many as people as possible contribute to the pilot. Doing the comments now is handy, but I don't think the real issues are going to come to an end until we do the pilot and the questions that come from the pilot. But overall, I think it's a good thing. I think it's doable. And if you consider that it's going to be done once a year, really it shouldn't be such a problem. I think some FSPs are going to have to tweak a little bit what they note about their client profile when taking on the client, because a lot of that needs to be reported on. But also in terms of the FICA risk and request for information, that information typically also has to be provided. So it's a little bit of a switch, but again, with anything, it'll be a process.
You've touched on some of the things that you think need to be fixed. Do you see any major shortcomings in the risk return that the FSCA needs to look at?
Well, there's a lot of questions that speak to conduct of the financial institution. So it speaks about non-compliance instances, it speaks about complaints, it speaks about failure to execute timeously. Remember, all of this is being submitted by the FSP, or the new language, the financial institution themselves. So there's a lot of subjectivity and a lot of marking of own homework. So how reliable critical information that actually informs the risk profile of a financial institution is going to be. Where you've got a large corporate with a dedicated compliance function which is independent, sure, you can rely very objectively on the information. Where it's a small FSP who doesn't have access to the resource, there's no differentiation between the person that's the key individual in the current term and the person who's responsible for compliance. The question is going to be asked, has to be asked, about how accurate is that self-reporting, especially on elements that may reflect poorly on that business. But I think that is going to be the challenge of principles-based regulation and supervision by the regulator.
Talking about principles-based, the recent regulatory update webinar, COFI was obviously on the agenda. And one of the things that you discussed when you were talking about COFI was that you didn't think that FSPs really need to panic about the coming of COFI, as some are. Why is that?
Well, Mark, I think firstly, I think people see COFI as a completely new set of legislation which is going to determine the way they earn their money and do their business. It's not. It's more a way of how you're going to get regulated. And we did the comparison in the webinar, and we looked at what are the chapters in the COFI Act. In other words, what is it looking to regulate? What is it that you need to comply with? What are the requirements that you're going to need to meet? And we've mapped it out that really every single thing is already regulated in some or other way, either by phase, by the fit and proper determination, by the General Code of Conduct, by the Administrative Code, by the PPRs. Somewhere it's being regulated. So I think one must just understand that how you're going to report on things and how you're going to evidence compliance is going to change. But the way you deal with a client, the way you get paid for that service that you provide, that's not going to change. You're not going to have to re-engineer your entire business, your distribution model, whatever the case might be. So I think that's the first thing. Secondly, a lot of it is already in the pipeline. Thirdly, that this is going to be a process. So where we are at the moment, the FSCA is positive that the COFI bill will start its parliamentary process this year or early in next year's parliamentary sessions. Knowing what we know about the regulatory or legislative process, it's likely to be next year. And that doesn't mean it just goes to Parliament and gets accepted. There's a whole parliamentary process. There's more consultation. It refers to the Council of Promises. I mean, I'm not an administrative law or legislative law expert, but so that's still a process. Then, remember COFI being a framework, the conduct standards, which are actually going to underpin it, needs to be published. And we're likely only to start seeing for comment, public comment, the first of those probably third quarter, maybe fourth quarter next year. That probably might go through one or two consultation processes. So be aware, I think, be calm, trust companies like ourselves to keep you informed. And when it happens, there will be a transition. So really, try and be 100% COFI ready at the moment is simply not feasible because we don't know what exactly the final details are going to be. But in principle and overall, it's going to be business as usual.
You recently did quite an extensive webinar on FICA compliance for motor vehicle dealers. And one of the things that you spoke about quite emphatically during that webinar was a culture of compliance. And I think the point that you made there applies across the board to all businesses.
Just for people that didn't attend, the analogy that I use is to say that, if you look at your business, look at it like, what you do in terms of your security at your home, and why you do that is you're trying to make your property, your home, as unattractive and as difficult as possible for people to commit crime, right? And if you approach your AML FICA compliance on that basis, that we are going to make it as difficult as possible for people to utilize our business to launder money, to finance terrorism, etc., then I think you've got the right mindset. And then that mindset flows from the top, and then everything makes sense. Implementing the compliance measures becomes second nature. It becomes business enabling. It becomes risk managing rather than a business impediment. But I must also just caveat here that where you have institutions which have recently come into the accountable institution net, due to the amendments to Schedule 1 of the FICA Act in 2022, and those are being supervised by the FIC themselves, there is a little bit more tolerance, a little bit more opportunity to remediate. But for financial services providers, compliance is a requirement now. It's been a long time coming. FICA is nothing new to financial institutions. So yeah, FICA as a thing as a matter that you need to keep your compliance hand on, as a thing that constitutes a business risk to you and a risk for administrative sanction, will remain very, very important. The fact that South Africa has been removed from the grey list shouldn't be interpreted that there's going to be a relaxation. In fact, the opposite is probably true, that we want to ensure that we don't get back on that list. And then the one tip that I can give every financial institution, every accountable institution in FICA, is that your sanction list screening of your clients is incredibly important, and being able to prove it on take-on, provable in terms of regular screening. Remember, it's not a once-off thing. But then specifically, when the sanctions list is updated, that you screen those new entrants onto that list against your client base, and being able to evidence that, because that's the real risk here. A RMCP that maybe fails to address a specific procedure is less important. The terrorist screening thing is an absolute requirement in all instances, and date stamp it and prove it. I think that'll go a long way in managing that.
Thank you for that, Billy. Thank you to all our viewers and readers of our newsletters. The team at Moonstone Information Refinery values your support. We hope you have a peaceful and enjoyable festive season.